Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Excuse me. Mr. Speaker, the Income Tax Amendment Bill will implement tax changes associated with the government's 2022 budget statement. On balance, I support the bill. However, I will concentrate my remarks on Clause 46, which concern related amendments to the Goods and Services Act. My speech will focus on the general merits and principles behind these amendments, and in particular, the impending increase in GST, which in part necessitate these amendments. More specifically, I wish to revisit the case for rebating fiscal surpluses in lieu of a more immediate increase in GST. As members of this House are aware, consumer prices continue their stubborn climb in August. Headline inflation clocked in at a scorching 7.5%, a 14-year high last experienced during the throes of the global financial crisis in the mid-2008. Pause for a moment and consider what this implies. Were inflation to remain at this rate, prices would double in just 9 years. Think, in 2031, a plate of chicken rice, my favorite example, would cost $7 instead of $3.50. A slightly used Honda Civic would be $220,000, and that's assuming COE prices don't increase further. A 4-room BTO in Sengkang, the constituency I represent, would go for $700,000 and likely double that in the resale market. To place this number in even more stark context, for the half-decade between 2016 and 2021, median household income rose by a respectable 2.8% per annum after adjusting for inflation. But had inflation been just at rates experienced over the past 6 months, paychecks would have shrunk by about half that rate. For those of us that still rent, the hit has been even more severe. Stories of landlords raising rental by up to 40% are not unheard of. What is worse, core inflation, the stable component of price increases, which strips out the more volatile components of private transportation and accommodation, struck 5.1%. This means that, much like in the United States and a number of other economies, price rises are gradually becoming entrenched in people's expectations, running the risk of a self-reinforcing inflation cycle. Now, to be clear, this is hyperbole. I do not expect inflation to remain at an elevated level of more than 7% over the next decade, nor do I expect the MAS does either. But that does not detract from the fact that higher prices have significantly eroded the purchasing power of Singaporean families, and that real and present danger of inflation becoming persistent means that the monetary authority cannot simply stand pat in the face of price pressures. What is the MAS to do? It has already adjusted the depreciation path of the Singapore dollar 4 times over the past year, and has even taken off a more aggressive stance of adjusting the exchange rate upward over the past 2 cycles. There is concern that in a small, export-oriented economy, an excessively strong Sing dollar will erode our competitiveness. Since October of last year, Singapore's exchange rate relative to its main trading partners has appreciated by almost 5%. Even so, the main bilateral rate of interest, the dollar exchange rate between Singapore and the United States, for which global commodities such as agriculture and energy, which we import, have gone the other way and depreciated by close to 6%. Small wonder then that in our economy, which is almost entirely reliant on imported food and fuel, we have continued to battle under the weight of inflation. Singapore's inflation dynamics appear to closely track that of the US, writ small. And since the Federal Reserve remains undeterred in its effort to raise interest rates to break the back of domestic inflation in the US, it is not unreasonable to expect for the MAS to embark on at least another round of of tightening monetary policy. Things look to remain challenging at least a while longer before they get any better. Indeed, it appears increasingly likely that we may need to accept that a soft landing, that our economy, where labor markets remain robust, may be a pipe dream. And if we accept that unemployment has to rise, then our workers are due for a double whammy. Singaporeans everywhere are already feeling the pinch from increases in the cost of living, feeling hurting from things that were previously they were able to comfortably afford. But should the economy slow in response to tighter monetary policy, it is the marginal worker that will be displaced from their jobs, losing their incomes at the time when they least can afford it. Now, with the economy about to face a right jab and a left hook, do we really want to shuriken our workers with a jump in prices of another 1% because of the GST rate hike in January? After all, as I shared in my adjournment motion with this House on July 5th, we should not be building up fiscal surpluses at the time when the economy is still in recovery and inflation is biting into our citizens' pocketbooks. I suggested instead that any excess revenues from taxes and duties should, as much as possible, be rebated back to our people. This is because fiscal policy should be playing a stabilizing role rather than amplify the stresses felt by the private sector. In the time that the speech was delivered, the Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore subsequently reported that tax revenue surged by more than 22% for the financial year 2021-22. This increase was led by corporate income, but individual tax receipts also rose, as did revenue across the board for most sources. The largest increase of 2.9 billion was due to higher stamp duties, which, due to, in IRS's own words, a buoyant property market and an increase in property transactions. Notably, the take from GST also increased by 22%, without any increase, even without any increase in the rate of GST. Tellingly, observers also expect that tax revenues in the upcoming fiscal year are likely to increase yet further. One analyst said that he expected government revenue to continue exceeding budget projections, while another believes that this increase will be due to strong corporate profits, rising wage growth, and higher property tax and stamp duties. In my speech on the budget this year, I suggested that with the inflation fire burning as hot as it did, raising GST would only add fuel to the flame. That was back in February, when inflation was only 4.3%. Inflation is now almost double this rate. The government has previously argued that they stand ready to address inflation with additional measures. Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong assured this House during his budget speech, and I quote, "If inflation turns out to be persistent and higher than expected, we, that is the government, will deal with this separately through other tools," end quote. He reiterated this position in April, stating that the government will assess the overall situation and then consider what additional steps they could take. One immediate objection to rebating fiscal surpluses is that the increase is only reflective of a low base from repressed collections in the prior year. But the revenues of 60.7 billion booked last year is not only larger than the low base of 49.6 billion booked last fiscal year, understandably due to pandemic-related reasons, but also almost 9 billion higher than the average of the 3 years before. Whichever our base year, it is evident that last year's revenue was an anomaly larger than previously anticipated. Another objection is that unexpectedly high surpluses, much of which are derived from real estate-related duties, are unlikely to be replicated and hence should not be utilized for recurrent expenditure. In principle, this is true. We should not be planning recurrent expenditures on the basis of one-off revenue gains. Yet, what is being proposed here is likewise a one-off expenditure. meant to tide households over this difficult period of high inflation. Nobody expects a continued stream of payout from the government once inflation returns to historical norms. Moreover, there's the prospect of even more extraordinary revenues in the forthcoming months. This government had previously indicated that it would be unwise to plan for new revenues arising from the OECD-led BEPS collaboration to roll out a minimum corporate tax. This caution may appear to be warranted given the unwillingness of the United States Congress to ratify the deal, which, ironically, it helped broker. But Mark Twain, the American novelist and social critic, is often said to have quipped that reports of his own death had been largely exaggerated. And much like this quote, reports of the demise of the global corporate minimum tax appear to be incorrect, or at least premature. There are good reasons to believe that in the medium run, there are strong incentives for non-adopters of the treaty, such as the US, to continue to do so, as long as other major economies also ratify it. The probability that this tax will proceed regardless of American participation or acquiescence lends further reason for the government to rebate surplus tax revenue now. Were the agreement to proceed even in slightly diluted form, it would almost certainly require changes to local corporate tax laws that are far more likely to raise corporate tax revenues than diminish it. The takeaway is that we appear to have fiscal wiggle room to move forward with such a rebate both now and in the future. What are some options that may be available to the government should it choose to rebate the 8.7 billion windfall revenue? In June, DPM Wong announced a 1.5 billion support package, which still leaves 7.2 billion on the table. One approach is to postpone the GST tax increases. Now, even if we accept that we cannot, in DPM Wong's own words, keep delaying the GST tax increase given our pressing revenue needs, we can at least try to forestall the increase for another 2 years. This will afford our households and businesses a breather and allow our economy to avoid a simultaneous constriction of both monetary and fiscal policy next year. Another alternative is to distribute the amount via GST vouchers. This will amount to another beefing up of the GST voucher scheme, similar to what had been announced earlier this year. The government had previously suggested that GST expenses would be fully offset for almost 20 years for our poorest households, and even for the richest, they will be covered for around 2.5 years. The reality of this claim has now since been eroded by inflation, and the vouchers would only make up less than 19 years for those in HDB 1 and 2 bedroom flats, and between 1 and 6 months less for others. Another GST voucher distribution would afford temporary, targeted, and timely support for our most vulnerable groups and help restore the government's original promise of the number of years of offset. A third strategy is to roll another off-budget support package that would offer broad support, similar to the resilience, solidarity, fortitude, and assurance packages, for which I'm sure the government will accompany with another clever moniker, perhaps reassurance. Such a move recognizes not only lower income quintile groups, while undeniably disproportionately affected by inflation, are not the only ones that have faced difficulties due to a higher cost of living. Of course, the government may choose, as it did during this year's budget, to combine a broad package that is with additional GST voucher support. The point is that exercising any one of these options, or them in combination, can make a significant difference to the immediate financial circumstances faced by our struggling households. Let me be clear. The Workers' Party remains opposed to a GST hike for reasons that we have previously articulated, not least because we believe that there are alternative revenue sources that could still be tapped. However, if the GST hike must go ahead now, at the least we can do is to further soften the blow with tools that we already have in hand.